Hello, this is just a quick recap of the tutorial session that we've just had. So 11 of you came along to the tutorial and I have written up the overview, but I've also done this video in response to the fact that people said they would quite like that as a recap. So we really just covered things that people have flagged up to me during the course of the last 3 weeks since the last tutorial that we had. So first one, acronyms. I was asked about acronyms, whether they could be used. The answer is yes, you can use acronyms, but the first time you mention it within the report, you must put it out in full. So if you were going to talk about the World Health Organization, for instance, just in brackets after the first time you mention it, put WHO. From then on in the report, you can just use WHO. Referencing, there was not many questions. We talked about referencing before, but there was a point about, finding references, and the rule of thumb is you always look for the original source. So if there's something you've read about in the learning materials and you think, oh, well, I can't reference the learning materials, if it's something where you really feel you're using somebody else's ideas rather than your own, find the original source. So either find it in a textbook or find it on the internet and reference that. So the idea of referencing is that somebody reading your report should be able to follow your references and actually find the same source as you've used. A few questions about word count. So it's 2,500 words plus or minus 10%. And that's for the main body of the report. So not the contents list, not the cover page, not your reference list, not the appendices. So if you highlight the heading introduction and then highlight right through to the last word in your conclusion, the word count number that you see at the bottom left-hand screen in Word, that is your word count for the document. So that's what has to be 2,500 words. A question about the fact that in the report template, there are word count guidelines for each individual section. These are just guidelines. If you go a lot over or a lot under for one section or another, that's fine. It's only the total word count for the main body of the report that matters. Okay, appendices came up as well. So if you've got really big documents for your appendices, rather than copy and pasting them in to the main report, if it's just for evidence, if you don't think the reader of the report's actually going to want to read all of that appendix, then you could just put a screenshot in of the first page. That would be fine. It's best not to embed documents. Brightspace doesn't like it. And very often you find that it doesn't work once you've uploaded the assignment to Brightspace. Each appendix should be referred to in the main report. So if you might say something like, within the report, you might say something like, an example of this can be seen in Appendix 1. If word count's short, or if you've already referred like this to the appendix, with actually using sort of a whole sentence, you could just put Appendix 1 in brackets afterwards. Okay, that would be fine. So appendices should be added at the end of the report in the order in which you refer to them in the main document. It makes it easier for the reader. I was asked about links. You could put a link within an appendix to a policy document, for example, where this is in the public domain. For public sector organisations, this wouldn't be unusual, as long as you're sure that the link will stay live for the next few months, so that external examiners may be looking at your work in a couple of months' time, the link would still work for them, but that would be okay. We moved on to talk about public sector organisations, because of something that Angela Spence had fed back to me following the PAT meeting. Yes, I acknowledge that we are going to add some more materials in about public sector governance. But in general, I think that for public sector organisations, in some way, it should be easier because they tend to publish a lot of objectives and policies and things like that. So accessing information is normally easier with public sector organisations. They can be complex though. So organisations within organisations, and we did briefly discuss this in the tutorial. We talked about the fact that an example was NHS Shetland. It would be better to focus on what happens within that organisation rather than the wider NHS Scotland or even the wider NHS for the whole of the UK. And likewise, I think we mentioned private sector organisations. If your organisation is owned by another organisation that's owned by another organisation, focus on the one that you're working in. That is the easiest thing to do. We talked about problems of confidentiality, accessing information. GDPR was mentioned, but I think that was a bit of a red herring. GDPR is General Data Protection Regulations, and that applies only to personal data, so individuals' personal data. And I can't see you would be wanting to access this. But it is possible that there's data, policies, procedures that are confidential that your organisation wouldn't want you to include or publish. And we had an example of a student who works for the MOD where that student has blanked out information that's confidential in the evidence provided in the appendices. That's absolutely fine. So there are workarounds for that confidential those confidential issues. You should still be able to access what you need. A question about how many aims and objectives should you be covering in the aims and objectives section, and the answer is you can't write about all of them. You should be looking at the organisation's high-level aims and the key objectives under that, and then it's better just to focus on maybe your own department, just a couple of objectives. Better to focus on in-depth explanations of one or two things rather than try and generally cover a lot of different things but not actually get down to the nitty-gritty. So that's the answer to that one. I asked for a bit of feedback from everybody who was there. We talked about Brightspace, layout of learning materials. Some people wanted less sections, some people preferred the fact that it was chunked up in weeks and then sections within that. We also talked about where you go to access the WebEx meetings, some people liking the fact they're all in one place, other people would prefer them to be within the module. So inconclusive really. We talked about the audio feedback and the fact that everybody liked the audio feedback for the draft assignment, but in future we could look at including a second screen video of the scrolling through the assignment at the same time to help with signposting. We talked about tutorial structure, so quite a few people were expecting a more formal lecture approach to tutorials, but I explained it was a conscious decision of the programme team that everything, there wouldn't be any live classes as such, but took on board the fact that some more sort of instructional videos within the learning materials would be useful. And that was us. So thank you to everybody who came along, and I hope this overview is helpful to you as well. Cheers.